So, welcome back, everybody. Now we enter into the deep of the Panama paper discourse, and I'm happy to introduce our keynote presentation with Frederik Obermaier. Thank you very much for being with us. And I have here on my left Max Heywood from Transparency International that is going to moderate the panel. Max currently leads the policy team at the International Secretariat of Transparency International. His main areas of focus are anti-money laundering policy, and he previously worked as an economic analyst in Argentina and holds a degree in economics and public policy. So I thank you very much for this. Also, I want to thank again the collaboration that we had leading to these events. And I leave the word to you and to Frederik. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Tatiana and team, for this fantastic event and for the presentation just now. That was also really, really excellent to get the visualization of what we're talking about now. And so it's a pleasure to introduce Frederik, who works with the Süddeutsche Zeitung, is an investigative journalist, also works with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, known as ICIJ from this moment on. And I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes to share with you what the Panama Papers meant for the people working in the field. So if I take you back to 2008, 2009, after the financial crisis, that was the first time that actually the issue of tax havens started to be on the agenda. So there was some rhetoric from governments and from the OECD around, this is a really big issue. The financial crisis was linked to issues of bad governance in the financial sector, which had links to tax havens. Then, of course, there was a fiscal cost to citizens, and and the whole austerity discourse that was also linked to that. But, and at that time there was a pretty small, I wouldn't call it a gang, but a pretty small group of people working on this issue. Nick Shaxson, who was here yesterday, was one of them. His colleagues in the Tax Justice Network, a very small community of people who were really trying to draw attention to this work. So with our colleagues, Maida, who was also here yesterday, and a couple of other teammates, we were working at the G20 level, trying to produce reports to push this issue on the agenda. And it was really quite a struggle, primarily because we were lacking stories. We just did not have enough materials to tell the story of why this matters, who's involved, what are the consequences, what are the impacts. It was seen as an issue that was, far away, complex, maybe irrelevant, or the relevance was not clear, perhaps untouchable, a little bit eccentric, maybe a little bit like a joke, like a gentleman's thing in the city of London, I have an offshore account, ha ha ha, that kind of thing. And it was, April 2nd or April 3rd, actually, 2016, the word game changer is used quite a lot, but it really was a massive change in the way in which this issue was seen, and we're going to talk about the impacts now. And it all started, I think, 18 months previously, with a message by someone calling themselves...
We never revealed it.
What's that?
We never revealed it.
Oh, you never revealed it. Anyway, a certain number of months before April 3rd, 2016, there was a message from someone calling himself John Doe, or herself John Doe, and at that point, I think we'll see what happened next.
Yeah, hi. Welcome, and thanks a lot for inviting me and having me. I start with that message. It was a message my colleague Bastian Obermaier, and we are not related, not married, simple coincidence, received on an encrypted way. And the message was simply, hello, this is John Doe, are you interested in data? And it sounds weird, but as a journalist, you do get these kind of messages regularly. But this message was different because in the further communication, it was John Doe revealed pretty soon that the data he or she has to offer is about Mossack Fonseca. And just to test it a little bit, who did know Mossack Fonseca before the Panama Papers? Ah, shit, we are working here within normally, there's nobody, but of course, here's Transparency International. Bummer, I should have tested before. At that time, Bastian and me already had done one investigation that was about weapons trade, where one offshore company popped up that was founded and administered by Mossack Fonseca. That was the only reason why this name caught our interest. I think otherwise we would have deleted this message and went on with our work. But who is Mossack Fonseca? I think now it's known, so I would skip forward a little bit. It's a law firm in Panama City. This was their building. The building still exists, but Mossack Fonseca doesn't have offices there anymore because they closed. And it was a law firm that was founded by a German, Jürgen Mossack, that's the one on the left side, and Ramon Fonseca, a Panamanian, the guy on the right-hand side. They're both lawyers. And they started with a pretty small boutique law firm offering financial services, as you call it, in Panama and in other tax havens. Sounds pretty clean, but it wasn't that clean. And that's what we found out when we, with the help of hundreds of journalists all around the world, searched through the data. On the right, that's the amount of the Panama Papers, 2.6 terabytes. I think now, in these times, we even have journalists working on bigger leaks, but at that time, this was, for us, terrible. Because you see what journalists were used to working before. We see Cablegate from WikiLeaks, offshore leaks, Luxembourg leaks, Swiss leaks, and these are the small little dots on the left. And we had the 2.6 terabytes. So you can imagine, and that's the explanation why it took us so long, because it was more than a year that we worked on the data. Because it was not that easy to go through it. Simply clicking through it, we did a small calculation at the beginning, and I think we ended up that it would take us, I think it was, we did that calculation, only Bastian and me clicking through it, and I think it was 32 years. So that was one of the reasons why we shared the data and why we used technology and not only our fingers to go through the data. What we found pretty soon at the beginning, and that was our selling point when inviting other partners, we found dozens of leads to heads of state. It doesn't mean that it was 70 heads of state directly being named in the data, but for example, relatives that were named in the data, and that's a common scheme. You normally, I mean, in the Panama Papers we found a lot of them, but normally in other leaks you do not find heads of states or heads of government. You normally find their husbands, wives, children, uncles, aunts, mothers, fathers, because that's like the simplest, easiest trick to use, not putting your own name, because if your name is Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump, that should normally ring a bell. It does not always, but it should ring a bell. And then you spoke about that evening on April 3rd. We had a little shock in our newsroom because we were supposed to publish at 8 p.m. And then shortly before, you see it, 12 minutes before, there was a guy who was known at that time as being an NSA whistleblower, leaking about our investigation. And basically, he was the one who realized that Bastian and me and Süddeutsche Zeitung cheated a little bit on our partners, because we all agreed to not publish before 8 p.m., but our tech guys asked us to have a little head start to test basically our multimedia graphics and videos, and they promised us that nobody will ever find that site. And well, there was a former spy sitting in Moscow who basically found it and nearly led to a heart attack in our newsroom. But it didn't do harm. On the contrary, Edward Snowden gave it a huge push at the beginning, so the term Panama Papers was only hours afterwards the term that was the most searched term on Google all around the world. Here you see some of the newspaper page ones of our partner, the Miami Herald, for example, The Guardian, and in the end it was around about 80 media outlets that really worked with the data, and then hundreds of others picking it up. That was 3 years ago now. This guy is history. That was the Icelandic Prime Minister who had to step back after the Panama Papers revealed that he had basically lied to the public in regards to some of his offshore companies. It's led to the biggest demonstration in the Icelandic history, and that was the moment when I realized that the Panama Papers is really something, at least for me, different, because I never had worked on an investigation that had led to a demonstration, nor to the biggest demonstration in a country like Iceland. And Iceland was not the only one. Here you see you see the protests in Iceland, where they have thrown yogurt and bananas on the offices of Mr. Gunnlaugsen. Here you see the mass protests in Pakistan. We had some in London as well, in Malta. And Pakistan was also somehow special because it was the first time that I got more than 10,000 Twitter followers within 24 hours. They all left me. I don't know why, but they were there. They were there because Sebastian, me, and some other colleagues twittered about what we have found about the children of the former head of government who was in the Panama Papers. And the daughter, Mariam Sharif, she basically presented some documents in Pakistan proving that we were wrong, that we are basically corrupt journalists who are spreading fake news. And this is very important. These documents were written in Calibri. I guess you all know Calibri, like Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial. She only made one small mistake. The alleged document proving us wrong was written in Calibri and signed allegedly at a time when Calibri was not yet in the Microsoft schedule, so it was not yet used. So that was how they basically caught her, and in the end indicted her, and her father, he also had to step back. Quite recently we had investigations opened up in El Salvador against Mauricio Funes, that's the former president, and there are investigations running against him in regards to money laundering. We have currently, we did a rough research, more than 1,000 investigations ongoing all around the world in regards to the Panama Papers. More than $1.2 billion have been recouped, basically taxes, penalties, fines that have to be paid. We have first indictment in the US. They indicted several people who worked for Mossack Fonseca, among them a German. We have laws all around the world called Panama Papers laws. They are sometimes, but I think we will speak about that later, good, sometimes not so good, but at least there is some change. And we had Mossack Fonseca being closed down. But I think it's an impact, but we shouldn't be naive. That doesn't mean that all their customers basically stopped doing business in tax havens, stopped hiding their money. We have to face the facts that a lot of them basically moved to other service providers. One of the Germans, by the way, who is indicted in the US currently, he was another proof how the whole business works. Because after the publication of the Panama Papers, he met with one of his clients. He took this client to a nice island, and they met there, and he basically explained to this client how he can still hide his money after the Panama Papers, what tricks to use, what jurisdictions, what banks. And the only mistake he made was not realizing that the guy who was sitting at the table with was already working as an undercover agent for the US authorities. That's how we know a little bit more how the business works and how those people, having worked for Mossack Fonseca, still keep on doing their shady job. I mean, we spoke a little bit, or you mentioned it a little bit. I think apart from these figures, that's only numbers. I think what is most important about the Panama Papers is that we are sitting here. That we are sitting here speaking about something as boring as tax havens, as boring as intransparent company structures, as boring as nominee directors, bearer shares. Let's face the facts. It's at first glance a boring topic, but it's a topic that is important for all of us because although we are sometimes not aware, we do see the problem of tax havens, the problem of intransparent company structures every day. I just saw it today when I heard that there are mass protests at the Alex about high rents. Speaking about high rents, one contributing factor is companies that are that intransparent that nobody knows basically who is behind it. Who is owning your house? Whom are you paying your rents to? Who is the one responsible for your rents going up? Who are those speculants? But that's a good side. But I do not want to hide the bad part of the Panama Papers. We will hear a little bit later also from my colleague Pelin, who worked on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers in Turkey, because she's one of those examples that the Reuters Institute just recently put out, that in 17% of the tracked countries, the journalists who covered the Panama Papers faced backlash. And backlash means threats. It means that basically some of them had to leave their post. They were basically fired. And it also means this, that Daphne Caruana Galizia, a colleague who was not part of the original Panama Papers team, but she worked a lot on the Panama Papers, and her son, Matthew Caruana Galizia, worked with the ICAJ as a data journalist. She was killed with a car bomb. And Jan Kuciak, a colleague, a very talented colleague in Slovakia, who also worked on corruption issues, on intransparent company structures, on issues that touched the Panama Papers. He was killed with his fiancée. And I think that's also something we should be aware of, that although this topic seems to be a lot about paper and a lot about nominee directors, shareholders, complicated stuff, that's stuff people and journalists can get killed for. And it also leads me to the whistleblowers. We have one whistleblower here in the audience, and I'm looking forward to hear her talk later. I think whistleblower, especially in Germany, sometimes has this notion of being something bad. In Germany we have this, we don't even have a real term for it. We simply, in our reportings, we still use the term whistleblower because there's not a German equivalent for it. So that's one part of the problem, and we should be aware when we are currently all around the European Union speaking about defending the rights of whistleblowers, putting the protection of whistleblowers in our laws. That means if we do so, we help stories like the Panama Papers being uncovered. And I think it's a shame that the whistleblower and the source of the Panama Papers had to hide his or her identity. I think it was a good decision because it's the best protection. Nobody could get me to reveal the identity. You could torture me because I didn't know it. I still do not know who John Doe is. If it's a man or a woman, I've never met this person, and from a professional standpoint, I also hope that I will never meet that person. In brackets, from a personal perspective, I'm of course curious. But I think that's something we should also keep in mind, that I can sit here speaking about the Panama Papers. Our authorities can be glad that a lot of money has been recouped, but we owe a lot to whistleblowers like John Doe, and although we do not know who it is, I think I want to repeat it here again. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Frederik. You touched on really a lot of aspects there in the intro, and I thought maybe to start to get a sense of the scale of the problem. So in the previous session, there was a mention of Gabriel Zuckman, who is one of the most respected researchers about this issue. And his latest estimates is that there's around $11 trillion held offshore, which is the size of the economy of Germany, the UK and France combined. So you have, the entire economy of these major countries is offshore in these, behind these obscure, systems and structures. So the first question I wanted to ask you was, do we have a sense of the scale of how much you were looking at with the Panama Papers? Is there any way to estimate, or is the system so obscure that it's not even possible to see what we were looking at in terms of the broader picture?
That's the problem. We still do not know it, because this whole industry is that opaque that they do not reveal something like their figures. Like in every other industry, you have like this market figures, like these are the 10 most important companies. They have a revenue of, or something like that. In the offshore industry and the secrecy industry, you don't have these figures. We even do not know, for example, how big Mossack Fonseca was in comparison to other law firms. While investigating the Panama Papers, we asked a lot of experts in Panama and outside, and there were some estimates thinking that Mossack Fonseca is the biggest one. Others told us it's the third biggest. Some thought, whoa, they are not even in the top 10. So that's how you can get a feeling how much we know, and with much in quotation marks, we do not know enough. That's a big problem. And one problem is, for example, that there is not in all countries a registry where you basically have to register who founded a company, who is administrating it, and that's also a problem. So there is a lot to be done by journalists, by academics, but I think also by the public. I think it's our task to ask who is behind certain structures. Have you ever looked upon your IKEA stuff? What is written on there? There's IKEA, and then you see something behind it. Have you ever asked yourself why it's like that? It's basically about tax havens, because like the patents for the IKEA stuff, they are not based here in Germany. They are not based in Sweden. They're based in a tax haven. That's how IKEA is minimizing taxes. So think about stuff like that. Think about stuff why, if you do have an Apple, if Apple does get money from you, you don't pay to Apple Germany. You normally pay to Apple, I think currently it's Luxembourg, if I'm not mistaken. If you're reading the news about money laundering, about corruption, if you do see, oh, there's a company involved in a tax haven, ask which tax haven. Point it out that this is a problem. Do speak with your politicians, with lawmakers. Ask them what are they doing to fight against intransparency in this field. What are they doing to fight against corruption? Because unfortunately, in most countries, it is not that much.
Yeah, and I wanted to pick up on the part that you were talking about, these registers, right? Because as you were saying, there are some countries now that already have these lists. So it's possible to go online and see behind every company registered in that country who is the actual owner of that company, right? So I want to ask, is that starting to make a difference in terms of, for journalists who want to look behind the scenes? You know, this small percentage of data that's coming online, is that starting to help?
Yes, every register, every jurisdiction that is opening up its register helps journalists, because and by the way, not only journalists, but also investigators from the police, from the tax authorities, activists, because you have to imagine that normally in a shady deal there's not only one tax haven involved, and it's not like only a tax haven. Normally you see a company structure that involves a bank account in Germany, maybe a company in Austria, then another company in Cyprus, then one in Panama, one in Luxembourg, one in New Zealand. And if you can open up at least one part of it, for example, the New Zealand part, that already helps you to investigate such a case. And why I mentioned New Zealand? In New Zealand, you can go online in their company register and type in my name and look if I'm owning a company in New Zealand. Disclaimer, I'm not. But that's something you cannot do, for example, in Germany. we are always, if you speak with politicians, they mention a lot, oh, we have the Handelsregister, we have the Transparenzregister, but as a normal citizen, you cannot find out if Frederik Obermaier is owning a company in Germany. And that's something that makes Germany not that different from Panama, by the way. Panama, even before the Panama Papers, had a company registry where you could basically only find out if a person is owning a company or put it in as a mentioned as a shareholder if you knew the company. That's the same in Germany. And that's why we should, in many respects, ask our lawmakers for more transparency in this field.
And speaking of the people behind these structures, right? If you do a sort of a Google or a bit of a research about the offshore sector, you're never more than sort of 2 clicks away from some pretty hardcore libertarian, taxes, theft, government is bad, you have almost like a human right to avoid your tax sort of, ideology. Does that come through behind the scenes when you're looking through the emails and the documents? Is there anything to help understand sort of, and I think Nick probably talked about this yesterday also, about sort of the ideology of offshore, does that come through?
Definitely. In the Panama Papers and other leaks, by the way, as well, you can read it in nearly every sentence. It's those documents and leaks offer us the insight basically in a parallel world. It's a parallel world that is only, where the entrance fee is quite high. So most of us here in the room, and I guess all of us, will not be able to enter this world because the entrance fee is too high. To basically open a company in Panama, you pay around about between $2,000 to $5,000. That's quite easy. That's not big a sum, but if you want to hide several layers of secrecy, nominee directors, shareholders, fake shareholders, then you're adding up more and more and more, and you can end up with fees that are like in 5, even 6-digit numbers. So that's why this world is only for the richest and the super richest, and they share one common theme. It's like the rules and laws a parliament, an elected parliament in Germany, for example, agreed on, they are not for me. They are not for me. Inheritance rules, I mean, we have laws about inheritance, Pflichtteil, as we say in German. But it's these guys saying, oh, whoa, this law is not for me. I will find another structure, maybe involving a Panamanian foundation, and then I will decide which of my children and grandchildren will get some money and which not. But what does it mean in the end? And in the end, it means that they don't want the German democracy. They don't accept it, and that's something we should be aware of. This is not, as some claim it, Kavaliersdelikt. It's undermining our democracy, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, and I was thinking, in some of the stories that I've seen, there's discussions behind the scenes in emails where some of the staff of Mossack Fonseca and others are saying, we've got to be careful with this one. We might get caught, right?
Sure. But, I mean, they even invented like fake names. So they don't speak about certain customers. They spoke about Harry Potter and Winnie the Pooh, and they didn't do it because they like Harry Potter. They did do it because they were very well aware that they had to hide the real identities even within their company, because they knew that they're committing, I would say, a crime, and I think they as well knew that they are committing a crime. So that's something, of course, that it knows. I even did shortly before we published the Panama Papers, I sat down with a Panamanian lawyer. I think it was 3 weeks before publication. He had a nice, cozy law firm, and we spoke about a certain service. I mentioned to him nothing about the Panama Papers, but that I have heard that some lawyers are offering a certain service. Basically, if a bank asks you who is the real ultimate beneficial owner, that's a technical term for the one who is hiding behind all the shells, that then there's a person saying, well, that is me. But in reality, it's still not that person. And he spoke about it, and he was really shocked, or pretending to be shocked, that a real shame, that's illegal. And he was a very dramatic little dwarf. He took a book from his desk, like, you see, this is the Código Penal in Panama. This is purely a crime. If anyone does this, he has to go to jail. But the one who does it or did it was himself, because he, 1 year before or two, worked for Mossack Fonseca, and we saw in our data that he has offered this service to his customers. So he was well aware of what he did. It's a shame, Código Penal. And by the way, he is now indicted in the US.
And did you see any instance of someone behind the scenes saying, you know, to their colleagues, for example, in email, you know, guys, this is wrong. You know, beyond whether it's legal, you know, I don't feel comfortable about this. This is not something we should be doing.
We have seen it sometimes, but it was one sentence here, another sentence there, but nobody really questioning the whole business model. Sometimes it was rather like, whoa, maybe this is not completely correct. We should be aware of the law, blah, blah, in jurisdiction X. So this was not a real game changer for them. And we have seen that, for example, if you looked who left Mossack Fonseca, because that's the people we looked for when we investigated the Panama Papers, because that's like a normal journalistic thing you do. You look for people who worked at a firm, approach them and ask them if they basically can tell you a little bit more. And it was not that many. So they were feeling pretty comfortable working in that business and doing that business that they did. And if you ask Jürgen Mossack and Ramon Fonseca today, they would still tell you that it was a completely legal business. I think, at least when they're on the record version, is still like, we did nothing wrong. I think in their heads, they know that what they did.
So just have a couple more questions, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience. There'll be some microphones coming around. And I wanted to ask you about something that was mentioned also previously about the future of this industry, if you want to call it in some way, and where it's going, and you know, the slow policy changes that we're seeing, and the slow progress towards more transparency, and where are they going to go next, if you're in that context?
To the next tax haven, and I fear there might be a very big tax haven growing bigger and bigger, right? Very near from us, speaking about the Brexit. I fear that the Brexit will have a lot of consequences in this field as well, because it could become a major business model of basically getting more and more money to the United Kingdom. I think the business is still doing well, the shady business. At the other hand side, and that makes me feel a little bit better, we do see that in the industry, people think at least twice what they do. I've been at some of those conferences where these lawyers are gathering, and you see that they are making their minds up what they should do and what they shouldn't do, because they are well aware of that while we speak, there could be an employer sitting there, plugging a USB stick in, downloading gigabytes, terabytes, and handing it to authorities or journalists. So I think there's a certain fear in the industry that makes everything a little bit more expensive, but it doesn't mean that it makes it too expensive for a lot of crooks out there. And we have seen after the Panama Papers in so many other smaller and bigger leaks, in the Paradise Papers or in the Troika Laundromat that there was the CRP revealed, we still see that the business goes on. We see it all around the world, but for me that keeps me going, because that's where we work on. And there will be a next leak. If it will not end up at Süddeutsche Zeitung, what I still hope for, it will end up in the hands of other newspapers and other media outlets, and that's good.
Thank you.
So I also wanted really to thank you very much. And by the way, I also say personal things, because I actually invited you 6 months ago, and you came, you know, so this also makes you really trustworthy in general. And in a sense also understood why the whistleblower contacted you, because you say yes, and you are here, and 6 months passed from that day. So thank you very much for being here with us, and also thank you, Max, for the moderation. And then I tell you to come back in half an hour. We will have the last panel of today that will discuss a lot about the consequence of whistleblowing and also journalism in this field. Thank you very much.